SAB 121 has been repealed, which is great news for Bitcoin. In this video, we're going to get into why SAB 121 made it difficult for banks to custody Bitcoin and other digital assets. We're going to talk about what this repeal means for Bitcoin adoption moving forward. It's really good. And we're also going to get into a potential negative that we could see with SAB 121 being repealed. Before I do get into the video, please make sure to like the video and also subscribe to the YouTube. Really appreciate your support. I'm also going to put a QR code for a Bitcoin tip. If you want to support the channel, feel free to leave me a little Bitcoin tip. Now let's get into the video. Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, more commonly known as SAB 121, was an accounting rule that basically made it so that banks had to recognize Bitcoin and other digital assets as liabilities on their balance sheet. Now, because the banks had to recognize Bitcoin and other digital assets as liabilities under SAB 121, this meant that the banks had to have a corresponding asset to match that liability. So let's say, for example, that a bank had $100 million worth of Bitcoin in custody. This would mean that the bank would have to have $100 million in cash or treasury bonds or some other asset to match that liability. Now, when we look at the banks, the whole business of the bank is to lend money out. So as a bank, you don't really want to have assets sitting there in custody, right? You want to be lending those assets out. So because of the business model of the bank, banks didn't want to hold that corresponding asset to match that liability. They would rather lend that $100 million worth of cash out and try to earn interest on it. A lot of people viewed SAB 121 as not very fair and kind of malicious towards the Bitcoin space, because when you look at traditional assets that banks custody, they don't have to mark these assets on their balance sheet as liabilities. So now that SAB 121 has been repealed, it means that banks don't have to hold that corresponding asset to match that liability. That means that banks are more incentivized to offer Bitcoin custodial services, and that we could see Bitcoin-backed loans coming soon to the commercial banks. Now let's talk about what the repeal of SAB 121 means for Bitcoin adoption, because I think it's huge. When we think about the fact that the largest financial institutions in the country are going to be getting more involved with Bitcoin, that is bullish. Like it or not, I'm not a huge fan of the banks. The banks are a place where people feel comfortable doing their financial activities. And if a lot of people see banks offering Bitcoin custodial services, then that may make them more comfortable with getting involved with Bitcoin. Now, the great part about Bitcoin is that you don't need a bank. You can hold the Bitcoin yourself. For this reason, I think that banks will probably go extinct one day, or at least transform into something that looks completely different. As we move into this internet world and we have digital money, custodial services are going to look different. We're not going to have these traditional banks with these big bank buildings. Custodial services are going to be more of a digital thing, and those institutions that have those custodial services are going to look different. But the fact that the banks are going to be offering custodial services means that more customers may be coming to this space. The banks are going to advertise this to their customers, and it's going to bring more people into Bitcoin. And with that, we're going to see more demand. We're going to see the price go higher. And as the price goes higher, that also brings more and more people into the network. So very bullish for Bitcoin. When it comes to having the bank custody your Bitcoin, I personally wouldn't do it. I love that you can just custody the Bitcoin yourself, and I think that's something that everyone should look into. And then if you are going to have a custodian, there are better custodians out there on the internet, right? Someone like River could probably custody your Bitcoin better than the bank. And there's also the fear of fractional reserve banking coming to Bitcoin, which we're going to get into in a moment here. With the banks now being able to custody Bitcoin, we're probably going to see the banks offering Bitcoin derivative products, which I'd probably stay away from, but that could bring more people into the space. And we're also going to see Bitcoin-backed loans become more common. And I think that Bitcoin really is pristine collateral, and banks are going to prefer that people use Bitcoin as collateral when they take out a loan or when they apply for a loan. And the reason that Bitcoin is pristine collateral is, for one, it's always appreciating, not always, but over time Bitcoin is going up, and banks like to see that. They'd rather have an asset that is appreciating as collateral than one that is depreciating like a car. And also the fact that Bitcoin is very liquid. It's easily collectible, it's easily transferable. If banks want to, they can sell that Bitcoin quickly and get cash. When we compare Bitcoin to something like a real estate as collateral, think about the hassle of having to collect the house from, whoever defaulted on their loan and trying to resell that house and deal with it. It's a ton to manage. And for me, I would rather just have a liquid asset if I was a bank, and an asset that is going up more than any other asset out there. So I think that Bitcoin backed loans are really going to become a standard as we head into the future. And it's going to be what banks prefer to hold as collateral because it's just a lot easier to deal with. If you're a bank, you don't want to have a car as collateral. You want something like Bitcoin that is going up in value and is just easily transferable, easy to deal with, unlike a lot of these other assets. To wrap up this video, we're going to talk about the fractional reserve risk that I see with the banks now being able to custody Bitcoin. When we look at the business of the banks, the whole business is really built around being able to lend out customer assets, rehypothecation. When you deposit a check at the bank takes that check and they try to lend most of it out to make more money. So let's say you deposit a check at the bank takes that money and they lend it out to someone else, and the person or party they lend it to defaults on that loan. If the bank isn't able to pay you back, then the government can come in and help the bank. The government can find money, or they can print more money and help the bank out. And when banks become too big and they run into these liquidity issues, we call these banks too big to fail, when the government has to come in and bail them out, or else there will be a systemic banking crisis. But the thing with Bitcoin is, let's say someone is holding their Bitcoin with a bank in custody and the bank lends that Bitcoin out. There is no backstop when it comes to Bitcoin. The government can't create more Bitcoin. The government is not the issuer of Bitcoin. Bitcoin has no central issuer. So because of that, you can't really bail out a bank if they don't handle their Bitcoin carefully. And I actually read a really good article called Too Big to Fail Banks in Bitcoin Custody by Preston Pysh. He's one of my favorite people in the Bitcoin space. And he talks about this in detail in the article and goes into why it should really be a law that banks should have to hold Bitcoin one-to-one. They shouldn't be able to treat it like other assets, like fractional reserve assets, because you really can't bail out a bank if they lend out your Bitcoin and that Bitcoin is lost through default. I do think that if you are going to have a custodian, it's important that you choose a custodian who's actually going to hold your Bitcoin one-to-one. When we look at the history of the banks and the track record, we know that banks are fractional reserve institutions. So just looking at that, I personally would never want to custody Bitcoin at a bank. If I wasn't doing self-custody, I would probably choose one of these Bitcoin custodial services like river. But when I look at the banks and I look at their history, I just don't really trust them. We can look at the FTX situation a couple of years ago. FTX was rehypothecating Bitcoin and other crypto assets, and it led to the failure of the exchange. So hopefully banks can take a look at that situation and realize that they need to be really careful with the Bitcoin that they have in custody. Overall, I'd say that the repeal of SAB 121 is great for Bitcoin because it's going to bring more people into the space, and it's also going to entrench Bitcoin into the traditional financial system, into the banking system. And when we think about future administrations, this is going to be hard to reverse, right? If the banks start keeping Bitcoin in custody and start offering Bitcoin services, that is just another sign that Bitcoin is here to stay. So I'm feeling super bullish on this news. If you didn't like and subscribe, please make sure to do that now. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon.